In ancient history, few figures have transcended the limitations of their time with such profound impact as Alexander the Great. Born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of the Kingdom of Macedon, to King Philip II and Queen Olympias, Alexander's journey from heir to the Macedonian throne to the architect of one of the world's most expansive empires is a saga of military brilliance, strategic vision, and unparalleled leadership. Under the rule of Philip II, the Kingdom of Macedon prospered. He managed to unite the Greek city-states and build one of the largest armies of the time. After defeating the Greek city-states of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC, Philip II led the effort to establish a federation of Greek states known as the League of Corinth, with him as the elected hegemon and commander-in-chief of Greece for a planned invasion of the Achaemenid Empire of Persia. In his early years, Alexander was raised by a nurse, Lenique, sister of Alexander's future general, Cleitus the Black. Later in his childhood, Alexander was tutored by the strict Leonidas and by Lysimachus. Alexander was raised in the manner of noble Macedonian youths, learning to read, play the lyre, ride, fight, and hunt. When Alexander was 10 years old, a trader from Thessaly brought Philip a horse, which he offered to sell for 13 talents. The horse refused to be mounted, and Philip ordered it away. Alexander, however, detecting the horse's fear of its own shadow, asked to tame the horse, which he eventually managed. Philip, overjoyed at this display of courage and ambition, kissed his son tearfully, declaring, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedon is too small for you," and bought the horse for him. Alexander named it Bucephalas, meaning ox head. Bucephalas carried Alexander as far as India. When the animal died, because of old age at age 30, Alexander named a city after him, Bucephala. When Alexander was 13, Philip began to search for a tutor for him. He chose Aristotle and provided the Temple of the Nymphs at Mieza as a classroom. Mieza was like a boarding school for Alexander and the children of Macedonian nobles, such as Ptolemy, Hephaestion, and Cassander. Many of these students would become his friends and future generals, and are often known as the companions. Aristotle taught Alexander and his companions about medicine, philosophy, morals, religion, logic, and art. Under Aristotle's tutelage, Alexander developed a passion for the works of Homer, and in particular the Iliad. Aristotle gave him an annotated copy, which Alexander later carried on his campaigns. In summer 336 BC, while at Aegae attending the wedding of his daughter, Philip was assassinated by the captain of his bodyguards, Pausanias. As Pausanias tried to escape, he was killed by his pursuers, including two of Alexander's companions, Perdiccas and Leonatus. Alexander was proclaimed king on the spot by the nobles and army at the age of 20. News of Philip's death roused many states into revolt, including Thebes, Athens, Thessaly, and the Thracian tribes north of Macedon. When news of the revolts reached Alexander, he responded quickly. Though advised to use diplomacy, Alexander mustered 3,000 Macedonian cavalry and rode south towards Thessaly. He found the Thessalian army occupying the pass between Mount Olympus and Mount Ossa, and ordered his men to ride over Mount Ossa. When the Thessalians awoke the next day, they found Alexander in their rear and promptly surrendered, adding their cavalry to Alexander's force. He then continued south towards the Peloponnese. Before crossing to Asia, Alexander wanted to safeguard his northern borders. In the spring of 335 BC, he advanced to suppress several revolts. Starting from Amphipolis, he traveled east into the country of the independent Thracians. And at Mount Haemus, the Macedonian army attacked and defeated the Thracian forces manning the heights. Taking over the invasion project of Philip II, Alexander's army crossed the Hellespont in 334 BC with approximately 48,100 soldiers, 6,100 cavalry, and a fleet of 120 ships with crews numbering 38,000, drawn from Macedon and various Greek city-states, mercenaries, and feudally raised soldiers from Thrace, Paeonia, and Illyria. He showed his intent to conquer the entirety of the Persian Empire by throwing a spear into Asian soil and saying he accepted Asia as a gift from the gods. This also showed Alexander's eagerness to fight, in contrast to his father's preference for diplomacy. After an initial victory against Persian forces at the Battle of the Granicus, Alexander accepted the surrender of the Persian provincial capital and treasury of Sardis. He then proceeded along the Ionian coast, granting autonomy and democracy to the cities. Miletus, held by Achaemenid forces, required a delicate siege operation, with Persian naval forces nearby. In spring 333 BC, Alexander crossed the Taurus into Cilicia. After a long pause due to an illness, he marched on towards Syria. Though outmaneuvered by Darius's significantly larger army, he marched back to Cilicia, where he defeated Darius at Issus. Darius fled the battle, causing his army to collapse, and left behind his wife, his 2 daughters, his mother Sisygambis, and a fabulous treasure. In the following year, 332 BC, he was forced to attack Tyre, which he captured after a long and difficult siege. The men of military age were massacred and the women and children sold into slavery. When Alexander destroyed Tyre, most of the towns on the route to Egypt quickly capitulated. Alexander advanced on Egypt in later 332 BC, where he was regarded as a liberator. During his stay in Egypt, he founded Alexandria, which would become the prosperous capital of the Ptolemaic kingdom after his death. Leaving Egypt in 331 BC, Alexander marched eastward into Achaemenid Assyria in Upper Mesopotamia and defeated Darius again at the Battle of Gaugamela. Darius once more fled the field, and Alexander chased him as far as Arbela. Gaugamela would be the final and decisive encounter between the two. Darius fled over the mountains to Ecbatana, while Alexander captured Babylon. Babylonian astronomical diaries say that the king of the world, Alexander, sent his scouts with a message to the people of Babylon before entering the city: "I shall not enter your houses." From Babylon, Alexander went to Susa, one of the Achaemenid capitals, and captured its treasury. He sent the bulk of his army to the Persian ceremonial capital of Persepolis via the Persian royal road. Alexander himself took selected troops on the direct route to the city. On entering Persepolis, Alexander allowed his troops to loot the city for several days. Alexander stayed in Persepolis for 5 months. During his stay, a fire broke out in the eastern palace of Xerxes and spread to the rest of the city. Even as he watched the city burn, Alexander immediately began to regret his decision. He ordered his men to put out the fires, but that the flames had already spread to most of the city. In only 6 years, he defeated Persia, was the pharaoh of Egypt, and the strongest man in the world, at the age of just 25. Before Alexander had the chance to find Darius, he was betrayed and killed from his own generals. Upon finding his body, Alexander ordered a proper burial fit for a king. Alexander was beginning to adapt the Persian costumes. He even dressed as a Persian in an attempt to get the Persians on his side. When he started demanding his officials to do the same, even bow down and kiss his hand, is when his people thought that he crossed the line. In Greek culture, kissing of hands was reserved for the gods only. Some officers accepted this as an offense, and some of them started plotting for his life. In 328 BC, he arrived at the edge of Persia and formed the city of Alexandria Eshate, the furthest Alexandria. After his marriage with the Persian noble Roxana, his men started questioning why he didn't marry a Macedonian woman and have a Macedonian heir, and lost their trust in Alexander even more. After several plots, Alexander started to replace his old companions, paranoid for his life. Alexander and his army had reached India, earning a victory at the Battle of Hydaspes. During this battle, Alexander suffered heavy losses compared to his earlier victories. Fearing the prospect of facing other large armies, and exhausted by years of campaigning and large number of deaths, Alexander's army mutinied at the Hyphasis River, refusing to march farther east. This river thus marks the easternmost extent of Alexander's conquests. Alexander tried to persuade his soldiers to march farther, but his general Coenus pleaded with him to change his opinion and return. The men, he said, longed to again see their parents, their wives and children, their homeland. Alexander eventually agreed and turned south. Someone asked Alexander on who would be his designated successor should he die. He responded, "To the strongest one." At the age of just 32, he fell ill. Alexander developed a fever, which worsened until he was unable to speak. In June 323 BC, Alexander died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon at age 32. And that was the end of one of the biggest empires to exist to this day. After his death, his empire was divided into three, called Hellenistic kingdoms, but none was ruled from his son he had with Roxana, as he was poisoned and died at the age of 13. That was the story of Alexander the Great, the most important man in history. See you on our next story.